At Black Nerds Create, we love all things fandom and creation, and we especially love fantasy. That's why we're excited for our newly named Black Magical History Month coming in February. Black Magical History Month is our 6th annual celebration of Black stories, characters, and fans across different fantasy media. Get ready for a month of digital events, challenges, and community turn-ups all across social media. To stay up to date and get more information, go to blacknerdscreate.com.
I'm Lin-Manuel Miranda, and you're listening to Hard NOC Life.
Well, it's the NOC in full color. You see me? The Hard NOC Life. Comics, movies, and TV.
Welcome to Hard NOC Life. I'm Keith Chow. This is a special episode. We're not covering the stuff that you saw at the Super Bowl because we're recording this before the Super Bowl because I'm planning on watching the Super Bowl and not recording a podcast. But season 3 of Star Trek Picard coming out on Paramount Plus this week. And to get ready for, I guess, the final season of Picard, aka season 8 of Star Trek The Next Generation, I've brought on everyone's favorite guest host to the podcast, my brother, Raymond Chow.
Red alert, guys. I hear it's going to be good.
That says a lot because my brother Raymond does not enjoy Star Trek Picard typically.
I'm trying to not be a hater because there's enough people on the internet that just kind of dunk on shit that they don't like, and I have too much affection for Patrick Stewart to want to dunk on him. But yeah, I did not enjoy Picard seasons 1 or 2. But they have pulled the nostalgia trap card by bringing back the entire TNG cast, and I thought I was out. I thought I wasn't going to give a shit. But as the date comes closer, I find myself drawn to it. Like Odo when he sees the Nebula, Omarian Nebula, and has to go back home.
Using the Deep Space Nine reference.
I'm all over the place, man. I'm
TNG.
all over the place.
As I said, we're all those dope trailers that debuted during the Super Bowl we will discuss next week with Brittany and Dominic when they come back. But this is all Star Trek all the time, this episode of the podcast. And I feel like my Trek bona fides have been rescinded because I don't think I've actually watched a Star Trek. Well, I watched season 1 of Picard, but before this new iteration, the Paramount Plus era of Star Trek, I feel like the last Star Trek I watched probably was fully committed to watching was when Raymond and I were teenagers watching Deep Space Nine.
Right. Deep Space Nine when it was on
the
air.
Voyager finale came after Deep Space Nine, right?
Yeah. Voyager was another 2 years.
So Voyager was the last Star Trek I fully committed to. Everything I don't think I've committed to any post Voyager Star Trek.
Well, I remember being excited for the first episode of Enterprise because it premiered on my birthday. And I was like, oh, it's meant. This is fate. It's gonna be great, because my birthday's in September and that's when all the new shows come on. But whatever, I didn't care. I think, and it was after 9/11, so everybody was ready to heal, and who was going to heal better than Star Trek?
Well, and Enterprise, I watched the finale of Enterprise just because. To your point about pulling the nostalgia,
it's an episode of The Next Generation,
right? Riker. Okay, that's that's typically how you draw me into any Star Trek. Anything is here's a TNG cast member, because as you know, Raymond, I didn't really get into Deep Space Nine until Worf showed up.
Well, so how did you get into Next Generation? What do you remember how you started watching it?
Well, spoiler alert, we're going to be counting down our top 5 Next Generation episodes, and full disclosure, neither Raymond nor I have shared what these 5 are going to be. I have no idea which 5 you've picked. You have no idea which 5 I've picked.
Oh, yeah. So question, are we doing this as top 5 that I gotta end with my number 1 as my all-time favorite, or is these just 5 episodes that I love?
No, we're counting them down, dude. 5 to 1.
Oh, okay. I gotta come down.
And there may be some overlap, there may not. But spoiler alert, my number 5 meaningful Next Generation episode to me is Encounter at Farpoint. It's not good. It's not one of the best episodes. It's actually quite forgettable. Patrick Stewart plays Jean-Luc Picard very differently in Encounter at Farpoint than he does like the rest of the series.
He is a Frenchman, sir.
He's actually French in that episode. They completely abandoned the fact that he's French for the rest of the series.
Well, so it's an interesting point because when I was originally thinking about, like, when I was going to pitch this idea to you of like, hey, Picard's coming on, we should talk about Star Trek. I was thinking of, rather than doing like favorites, of going through, like, if you had to explain Star Trek Next Generation in 5 episodes, what would you pick? And in that list, Encounter at Farpoint shows up for me because it's the pilot.
Well, so I mean, the reason and we'll dig into this more when we actually run down our top 5, but like the reason I'm saying that, because you asked me, like, how did I even get into Star Trek? And it's because I was 10 years old and I used to essentially live in the back office at our family restaurant. And the only thing that kept me company was the television. And, you know, I wasn't really, I didn't watch the original series. I recall, like, vaguely it would be on sometimes that, you know, I was like, it was in the ether. Again, I'm 10 years old. I wasn't really into Star Trek. But I remember, you know, there was like a lot of hype around the Next Generation. And I'm pretty sure I was already watching Reading Rainbow by that point. And so I knew LeVar Burton was going to be in the new, because again, this was 40 years ago. This was pre-internet, like Reading Entertainment Weekly even.
So, you know, like the Reading Rainbow episode that takes place on the bridge, like, did you remember seeing that?
Well, that episode had to come out after Next Generation debuted. But I just, maybe it was like a preview, like, you know, like a commercial, and I saw LeVar Burton maybe. Something like that. I mean, again, it's hard to remember from like when I was 10 years old, but I just recall like, oh, there was this new take on Star Trek coming out. And it was like 7 p.m. on like a Wednesday. I don't know what day it debuted on the local, you know, syndicated Paramount affiliated channel in, you know, outside of Washington, D.C. And I watched Encounter Farpoint. And from that point on, I was like, oh, I really like this show. You know, I thought Q was cool. And I was hooked from that point. And I watched the first run of Star Trek The Next Generation in real time. And then when did you start watching? Because you were 3 when. Yeah,
I'm pretty sure that I didn't really get into it until. So I know that I think my first memory of ever watching the original series was, I don't remember what trip I was on with our parents, but we were in Canada or we were in Hong Kong, and we were in a hotel and the original series was on. And I remember watching episodes of the original series there. And that was probably like the first time I ever watched the original series. And then I'm pretty sure that, and I remember that the Next Generation, I had seen an episode here or there, but it never really registered with me until the episode that's on my list, All Good Things, is on my list, the final episode. And what they did was they did a marathon on like channel, I guess that was channel 7 at the time in Chesapeake. They did a marathon on that weekend of like all of the 10 best or 10 famous episodes of Next Generation. And I watched it all like back to back in anticipation of All Good Things. And that was the moment where I was like, oh, this is a really good show that I had like missed out on. But you don't really miss out on Star Trek in that era because it was always still playing every week.
Right.
At that time.
And it's funny, right? Because All Good Things, the last season of Next Generation, you were 10 years old. That was 94.
Yeah.
So something about being 10 and a chow that draws you to Star Trek.
That's when the mood can strike you.
Because I also remember taking you to see Generations.
Yeah, like definitely by the time Generations had come out, I had probably seen.
Well, that was that fall. Like, to your point, if you like, if All Good Things was your catalyst, and you know the marathons or whatever, it was probably also in anticipate. You like basically like did a crash course in Trekkery.
Yeah, well, because it was still playing every weekend, right? So like every weekend I could watch an episode, and I think I was able to see most of 4 through 6 probably by the time of Generations being in theaters.
Because we went to see Generations at the Chesapeake Square Mall area, whatever theater is over there for some reason. I don't know why we went over there. This means nothing to anyone listening to this podcast who doesn't.
Yeah, but I do remember that was the first time I ever saw a dude in a Starfleet uniform. A dude was wearing a Wrath of Khan era Starfleet jacket.
Your first encounter with cosplay?
Yeah, that was the first time, and I don't remember if there was a Klingon. That might just be my brain filling in gaps, but there was definitely some dude that was like a lieutenant in the red jacket.
Yeah, so like 94 is probably then the catalyst year for you for sure, because
that's probably Star Trek at its second peak, right?
And arguably probably a greater peak than even in the 60s, because just the reach of Star Trek in the 90s was far greater than any reach it had in the 60s.
Right. So like that's probably the moment where Star Trek had its most success without like any caveat. You know what I mean? Like very few people remember the original series' third season fondly. The movies, I mean, Star Trek 6 was only a couple years before it. So like to go from Undiscovered Country to Generations, and you're in the, golden era of season 4 to 7 of the Next Generation, like that's peak Star Trek.
Right. Talking about hype, the biggest hype around Generations was Kirk and Picard coming together.
Yeah. Right.
That's what sold it to people who weren't necessarily TNG fans.
Right.
And we'll talk about Generations maybe a little bit as we progress. But so that's the origin story of how you and I and from 94 on, at least from 94 to 98, I think, Star Trek was definitely, again, like a bonding thing between the two of us, because we watched Next Generation together. We, at least the movies. I eventually came around to watching Deep Space Nine with you. Because when did season 3 of Deep Space Nine start? That was around that time too, like 95. 90.
Yeah, because season 3 should be the same time that season 3 is after Generations.
The first two overlap with Next Generation.
Yeah. Season 2 and season 7 overlap, right? So season 3 was probably the only year that. Well, no, because then Voyager was probably coming out in 94.
Voyager launched in 95 because
95.
It launched UPN.
Yeah.
And then, but like once Voyager launched, I was already watching Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
Because again, I was brought in because the hype was Lieutenant Worf is not just cameoing, he's joining Deep Space Nine as a character. And, The Way of the Warrior was like my intro into Deep Space Nine, because I didn't watch the first 3 seasons at all. Like, at least not in real time. Of course, I would go back and watch them. Yeah. And remember, not really, even when doing a rewatch, not really clicking into Deep Space Nine until Avery Brooks shaved his head, or at least until he grew the beard. Because I think the episode where he and Jake are like sailing in the stars, like explorers, like he has grown his beard, he hasn't shaved his head yet, and I was just like, okay, I like that.
Second to last episode of season 3.
Yeah, I needed Cisco to be more like Hawk before I could get.
You needed him to be bald
before I could get into that show. But season 4 beyond, like Deep Space Nine, became my favorite. Not just my favorite Star Trek, like one of my favorite shows of all time. But again, that said, my Trek bona fides pale in comparison to you, because I've watched Deep Space Nine through once. I've watched Next Generation all the way through once. And Voyager,
like you never like pop in another.
I mean, I've rewatched certain episodes. Like I've seen Far Beyond the Stars multiple times. I've seen All Good Things multiple times. But to sit down and watch, what is it, 300 episodes of television?
Sure.
I can't do it. I'm sorry. I honestly don't know how you do it, because you do like an annual Star Trek rewatch.
Well,
on top of like annual West Wing rewatches and
yeah, it comes and goes. It's just kind of, I'm in the mood. It's when I need a hit, man. I need a hit of that nostalgia. I just go watch the show again. That's what I've never understood about like I'm happy for people who can go buy memorabilia and all that stuff, and it makes them happy. But it's just like I just watch the show again because it's right there, and especially now that we live in an era where it's on your phone at any time of day if you want to. It's like, yeah, well, whenever I want to hit, there it is.
So I will say that speaking of memorabilia, though, like that period in the early 90s was also a period where we were buying the Playmates figures and the ships.
Right.
And I remember one I think it was the Christmas of 94, that year, the year you became a Star Trek fan, you got the transporter.
Oh yeah.
Christmas present. Which was really cool.
Which I think is still in our parents' house somewhere. Although the batteries have probably like melted and.
Well, you still have. I'm sure you still have Voyager and the Deep Space Nine station in Mom's house, I think.
Yeah, and the Defiant.
Yeah,
never was able to get an Enterprise because why didn't we get there was a Generations Enterprise D toy, but I don't know. We never picked it up.
Yeah, I don't know why.
It was probably too expensive.
Yeah, maybe
for us at that time.
But you had all the figures, like you had at least all the Next Generation figures. I don't know if you had.
Yeah,
I think you had.
Do you remember the Generations figures were frustrating because they were a different uniform?
Oh, was it because they were in the all black and not the?
Well, I think that they had originally designed new uniforms for Generations, and then that got too expensive, or they fell behind in production. So
that's right. It was like based off of like concept art and not.
Yeah, so it's like closer to kind of what they wear in the alternate future of All Good Things, design wise, and like so we got a lot of the Generations toys, but they weren't like right. And there was also a Captain Kirk toy from a deleted scene where it's Parachute Kirk, and he's in a jumpsuit that is in a scene that never made it to the final cut.
Oh, I completely like blocked out the fact that the Generations figures were based on concept art.
Yeah,
that's funny because they're almost like they have. I'm just looking it up now. They have like a flap instead of like just the regular, because it's like
and
it's like a combination of like the Deep Space Nine jumpsuit, but it's also still multicolored. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. That
I mean, it definitely like especially like if you look at like what the new uniforms look like on the current shows, like you can see it as part of the evolution, but it's just interesting that they for the production got that far in the toy line and then it just didn't happen. And then I guess like no one told the toys, or honestly, the toys didn't care, and they said, "Well, we already made these. We're not dumping them." So
and that happens, and actually that happens all the time, where like the toys are based on concept art, and the changes because toys have to go into production so much earlier than movies do. But yeah, so all that said, we're talking about this because, as you may or may not know out there in podcast world, Star Trek Picard, which is the Paramount Plus reboot, I guess, of the Picard character. One of the things that I was actually excited about when Picard first debuted was the fact that I had always clamored for Star Trek stories to take place in the future, like in the post-Voyager timeline, because that's, as we said earlier, like that's our bread and butter, like Next Generation, Deep Space, the 24th century Star Trek is what we know, more so than the original series. But everything that came out post Voyager, whether it be Enterprise, whether it be the JJ verse or the Kelvin verse, or even the things that Paramount Plus came out with, Discovery, and now we have Strange New Worlds and everything, like they're all in that like in between period before Kirk, or at least Kirk's early years, right? Like all the like the Star Trek of the last probably 20 years or so all kind of took place in that prequel era of Star Trek. And I just could never not even identify is the right word, but like it was a different type of nostalgia they were kind of like getting at, right? They wanted to bring back all of the original series fans, I guess. To them, Kirk and Spock is the ideal Star Trek. And it was Picard's return that signaled to me like, oh no, we're now signaling that there's a whole generation, pardon the pun, of Star Trek fans who identify with these casts of characters and not necessarily like seeing Scotty and Bones and everyone. All that said, maybe because I was so happy to see them finally tell stories, post 24th century, that I ultimately was really disappointed in the first season of Picard, that I actually didn't even watch season 2. I know you weren't a fan of either season. Is it fair to say that, and again, without dunking, because I know that, the reason I could never identify with the new Star Trek is not because I have this real, first of all, it's the Nerds of Color. It's not like we're like, oh, it's too woke or whatever. I never understood Star Trek fans who complain Star Trek is too woke.
Right.
Because what the fuck have you been watching the last 70 years?
Yeah. Although with one of my picks, we're gonna get into that a little bit. But we'll get there.
Oh, interesting. Is Angel 1 in your top 5?
Actually, if we were going to do the other idea of episodes that you have to watch to understand the Next Generation, I was going to pick Code of Honor, which is the one where they go to a black planet, and it's kind of universally considered the most racist episode of Star Trek because it's terrible, but it's an interesting terrible that you hope you can learn something about Star Trek's attitudes from, I think. So
that said, I just couldn't get into the new era of Trek for various reasons.
because you go back to the 24th century and it just looks like Los Angeles.
Well, yeah, there's that too, right?
Like every setting is just some sort of it looks like their agent's office a lot of times.
Are you talking about season 2 of Picard?
Season 1 and season 2, every time. Well, season 2, actually, yeah, it takes place in the 21st century, so I guess that makes a little more sense.
But I think you and I talked about this at the time. Isn't 21st century in Star Trek world supposed to be very different from what you and I experience as the 21st century? So that's the thing that I was kind of didn't, and and I said this on the podcast last week, continuities for nerds, and I've aged into the wisdom of not having to be a stickler about continuity. That said, when the Picard team traveled back to the 21st century and it's our 21st century, I get why they did that, one, because it was cheaper, right? To just as you said, go outside and just film the back streets of Los Angeles. But from what I remember from when Deep Space Nine would go back in time, or even references in Next Generation, 21st century is a shit show. Aren't we in Civil War, and isn't there just, I mean, well, yeah, it's kind of a shit show now, I guess, in certain, if you look outside too, but
yeah, they do point in season 2 of Picard to the fact that they do point to the Deep Space Nine episode Past Tense, where Captain Sisko or Commander Sisko goes back in time, and they all think that he's poor and crazy, him and Dr. Bashir, and then they end up leading a poor people's revolt, right? For being forced into the slums of Los Angeles. So there is mentions of that so the sanctuary districts that happen in that episode of D69 do get some kind of set decoration that it's coming in the Next Generation in Picard, but they don't really get into it. And yeah, it's interesting because it's still 100, I think it's 50 years later, there's still going to be a World War III coming, which is definitely happening because Strange New Worlds pilot episode they set a date. They said World War III happens in 2026. So it's coming, guys. get ready.
So yeah, so that's Picard, and as I said, I was kind of I tapped out after a couple episodes of season 2. Still haven't gone back to finish it. Also, truth be told, as excited I was to see the further adventures of Picard, one thing that's kind of weird, and spoilers for Picard if you haven't watched yet, is that at least post season 1 of Picard, it's not even fucking Picard anymore. Isn't he a robot now?
Yeah, he's an android that will age and die and look exactly like a human as he ages and dies. So
that's weird.
Yeah.
That was a weird choice.
Yeah. and that is like, I'm trying to understand why the show doesn't work for me. And it's not the wokeness of it. Like the wokeness, all the woke elements of it are fine. Like that's
Well,
what
again, it's Star Trek. Like that's not even a valid good faith argument, and we're not even going to give it any quarter because it's just dumb. And like people, it's anyway. Yeah, it's not even worth.
But there are, for me, it was just like you set up all of these interesting premises, and then they set them all up, and they don't know what to do with them at the end, and so they just find like it's just Occam's razor, but Occam's razor making it dumber, and the solutions to things are such that you don't care anymore. Like they wrote themselves into a hole, and it's like, well, how do we get out of it? I don't know. Make him an android. Okay.
Well, especially here's the thing. I mean, and maybe this was the point, but like so much of Picard's, particularly like in the movies and post Next Generation, is about Picard's whole Borg, PTSD.
Well, okay. So do we want to get into the problem with Patrick Stewart?
Sure.
Okay. Well, so this is the thing. Let me front load this with nothing but praise first. That, obviously
Sir Patrick Stewart,
Sir Patrick Stewart, one of the greatest actors to enter into the science fiction realm, elevated the Next Generation, elevates X-Men, is a reason that a lot of those things work. But I think the reality is that he's also part of the problem. And here's some of my evidence for that. One of Patrick Stewart's favorite episodes of the Next Generation, and I have receipts. There's research that can back this up. That he'll say that this is one of his top 10 episodes of the Next Generation. Is an episode called Starship Mine, where the Enterprise is evacuated because they're doing like a what's it called, a baryon sweep. They're gonna clean the Enterprise basically, and then some terrorists sneak on board. And so Captain Picard has to do Die Hard on the Enterprise. And that's one of his favorite episodes because he gets to run around and punch people for 45 minutes. And if you look at like the production of Generations and really all of the Next Generation movies, Patrick Stewart's notes as the lead actor for those movies was, I want more action scenes.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do a lot of the fighting. Because I think that he was possibly having a midlife crisis and he didn't want to be, he had been playing the old man for kind of a long time. He was famously Gene Roddenberry didn't want Patrick Stewart because he thought he was too old, even in the first season. Yeah. He was already playing Claudius in Hamlet in 1981. And then like 30 years later, he's still playing Claudius because he still looks old. He's just been an old man for a long time.
He's got like Steve Martin syndrome. Even when he was a young man, he looked old. Right.
And, but it also means that he doesn't look like he ages at all because he's always looked old. Right. You get so old and you're just there forever. So I think maybe that's what was happening. So all of the Next Generation movies have this weird energy to them because it's like, why is there this dirt buggy scene? Like, what are we doing here? Because Patrick Stewart wants to be out there and like fighting things. He likes explosions.
And to be fair, one of the problems of the Next Generation movies is that they were too hyper focused on Picard and Data.
Yeah.
To the detriment of like the rest of the cast.
Right. Yeah. Everybody else is a glorified cameo.
Right.
Really, unfortunately. And I hope that one of my hopes for season 3 of Picard is that this is an opportunity to give Beverly Crusher her due. And it does sound like from what bits of the story that's come out so far that she's getting a little bit more to do, which I'm excited for, because she was a character that got to do a lot more in the show than she ever does in any of the movies. And I think it's a shame. So I think that when the Paramount powers that be came to Patrick Stewart and they said, hey, we're going to do Star Trek Picard, we want to do it, are you in? And he said yes, I think he said yes, but only if I can be an executive producer. And here's what I think the problem is. I don't think anyone knew how to say no to Patrick Stewart. So if he had an idea, what if the Romulan woman's in love with me? Oh yeah, sure, we'll make that work. Whatever you want, man. You're Patrick Stewart. And I think that that's where they kind of write themselves into all of these traps in the show is, and this is all speculation, but I think that Patrick Stewart was just throwing out a lot of ideas of where he wanted the character to go, and they were trying to write around that rather than breaking an actual story.
Well, so Ken, explain Robot Picard then. Like, whose brilliant idea is that?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying, right? Like, I can't
imagine Patrick Stewart saying, you know what would be really great if they put my essence in a robotic body that will also age and die.
Yeah, but I think that the problem is that he probably ended up in some sort of area of, I think it was part of his, like, his idea of, like, how to put to bed Picard, and they didn't, I don't know if did they know at the time that they were already guaranteed for a season 2?
I don't know. But I also, like, I mean, I remember now that I'm thinking back to season 1, because I think I might have just, like, suppressed all memories of that season.
Well, it's not even that you suppressed. It's unfortunately, and this is the thing, is it's forgettable.
Right.
Because all of those premises don't come to some.
Well, because the thing is, right, because, like, there was this whole theme of, like, you know, androids are kind of like an oppressed class of people, right? It wasn't. Yeah. Am I imagining that?
No, that's, yeah, they're an oppressed class of, well, yeah, they create new Sung type androids based on data. Well, based on, I guess, the parts they had from B4, the third brother of the third data type.
The one from the movie.
The one from Nemesis.
And I just remembered, like, I don't know, I just remember just not jiving with that whole storyline, and, like, it kind of, because I felt like it kind of undermined the whole Measure of a Man episode, which is also in my top 5.
Right, the rights that that androids have rights, absolutely. But also that, like, the plot is the Borg are involved and the Romulans.
But, like, the Borg, wasn't there was a whole thing about, like, Borg, like all the ex-Borg now, right? Because now the Borg are,
yeah,
everyone is 7 now, essentially, right?
Well, it's not clear how. I don't think they ever explain clearly where that there's a defunct cube sitting in Romulan space that the Romulans and the Romulans are letting other people kind of use as they kind of dismantle it and rehabilitate the drones that were there. Although it seems like there are still thousands and thousands of drones on the cube that are kind of just in stasis.
And the other thing that I remember just kind of rolling my eyes at in Picard 1 was, like, the finale when, like, 1 million starships showed up and there was, like, this full-on battle. And it just gave, like, Rise of Skywalker vibes, because, like, that's what I hated about Rise of Skywalker was, like, all of a sudden all the there's this supposedly massive battle in space between, you know, the Star Destroyers and the new Resistance or whatever, and it just, like, was just dumb. And that's kind of the vibes I got from the last episode of Picard. Again, I might have been imagining this whole thing. That happened, right?
I think it happened, but what I think that the problem is, it's not that it's dumb, it's that it's unearned. It's that it just shows up and you don't feel anything for it. Because I'll compare it to at the end of Deep Space Nine season 5, where
the Dominion War,
it's the beginning of the Dominion War, and there's a scene where, like, Kira's mad at Federation because she's like the Dominion are coming, why aren't they sending us any ships? And Cisco's like, well, I can't tell you, it's classified. And that's a scene that happens 20 minutes in. And then at the end of the episode, there's the final scene is they leave Deep Space Nine and they join the Starfleet fleet, and you see, you know, not 100 ships, but like 30 ships together, and you think, oh shit, because you know it's about to go down. And, like, so you can have a scene with dozens and dozens of ships on the screen, but you've got to earn it. It's got to be set up for something. They just show up because Captain Riker at the end is like, yeah, I just knew you'd need help. And I just was able to convince all these ships to come along with me at this single moment.
And then, because it's that kind of, like, you try to jump the line essentially to get, like, this big epic scene that falls flat. Like not everything can be the final fight in Endgame. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like
Right.
that similarly was felt earned when all the portals open and all the superheroes come out. Like you waited 10 years to see the entire Avengers kind of assemble, right?
And 3 hours.
Right, exactly. Right. No,
Yeah.
but it's true. Like the reason that of all my issue with superhero movies, the third act always sucks. The reason that Endgame's third act works is that it's not just a third act, it's the culmination of 10 years of like, storytelling.
Right.
And I think Rise of Skywalker and Picard season 1, I just remember feeling the same way in those final battle scenes and thinking like, this is stupid. What, I don't care about any of this,
Right. It's just bigger without like making bigger didn't make the conflict more interesting.
Right. So that said, season 2, I started the first couple episodes. I remember like it was kind of cool to see Guinan again but I think where I tapped out in season 2 was like there was a whole like thing about his mom, right?
Oh. Yeah.
That seemed weird.
Yeah.
And then the time travel stuff. What I did like about season 2, I will say, or at least the first couple episodes, my favorite thing about season 2 probably was John Delancey shows up as Q and says, "Oh, you look old now. Let me look like you." Snaps his finger, and he becomes like modern day John Delancey. It's like that's how they in universe explain why an immortal being looks like an old man.
Right.
I thought
he's just trolling Picard. Like that's a
who again at that point is a robot.
Right, which he doesn't bring up. Like which he doesn't bring up. He doesn't mention like, oh, you seem different somehow, but I can't quite put my finger on it.
Some omnipotent being he turned out to be. I know they go back in time and they try to change the timeline because Q made them live in a like a fascist regime or something like that. Wasn't Picard like the leader of some fascist regime in the future or something?
Yeah, so it's kind of my guess is the writer's room went, okay, what are the best episodes of Star Trek, and let's throw them all together. So like, oh, we'll have Q in it. Yeah, absolutely. Let's do a little bit of Yesterday's Enterprise because the same thing. Yesterday's Enterprise. There's some time travel shenanigans, and that results in militaristic, fascistic future. So we'll do that, and then we'll also do
we'll throw in some Voyage Home while we're at it.
Yeah, let's do some Voyage Home. So we'll send them back in time, and they'll hang out in the 21st century, and that'll be cool. Yeah, and then let's also do the City on the Edge of Forever. So you gotta let this person die or not let this person die, so that the future can be saved. And so we'll throw that in. And then the season 2 finale of the original series, Assignment Earth, which was a backdoor pilot. No one knows what to do with that. Well, let's throw that in too. We're going to make this reference to that thing. Why not? And they layer all these things on top of each other in a way that like kind of falls apart. So, okay, quick recap of season 2 is Picard's living in his chateau. Elron, his Romulan adopted friend, he's a cadet in Starfleet. Rafi is, I think, number 1 for the Excelsior. Rios has joined Starfleet and was given the captain's chair of either a refit or a new ship called the Stargazer, which was Picard's old ship. And I don't remember where. I think 7 of 9 was still a ranger hunting down bad guys in her spare time. And that's kind of where everyone is. Oh, Alison Pill's character she's still kind of just doctor somewhere. But what happens is that a cube shows up, a Borg cube shows up, and so Starfleet's like, we need Captain Picard to go handle the cube. And so they get a whole fleet. It's 1,000 ships, just like we were talking about, show up, and they're fighting the Borg cube. And then the Borg queen is some sort of new mysterious queen. And it seems as if this new mysterious queen sends them into the past, but it turns out that it's Q. So Q sends Picard and everybody that was in the cast conveniently, even though they weren't on the same ship, into the past. And they wake up in an alternate future where it's the fascist future, and Picard is now like General Praetor Picard or whatever, and he's murdered Ducat and Gowron and everyone. Like he's the Federation's #1 badass, or whatever they're calling it. And Seven of Nine is the president of the fascist state. And then it turns out that they capture a Borg queen, but not the Borg queen that they were dealing with in the future. And the Borg queen's the one that's able to tell them that what happened that changed their timeline was Captain Picard's great grandmother, Renee Picard, was going to be the first woman on a ship to Europa, and that because that flight didn't happen, so we're doing some First Contact vibes, because that flight doesn't happen, their future loses all hope, basically. And like that's why we're in a fascist dictatorship, is because his great ancestor did not discover what she was going to discover on Europa. So they decide, okay, we've got to travel back in time, and then they use the Borg Queen to go back in time to the 21st century, but it doesn't work exactly. And so Rios wakes up in like a undocumented worker clinic, and that's actually like the only arc of the show that's actually somewhat interesting, is Rios as a Latino man is like experiencing INS. You know, that's kind of a classic Star Trek thing, but like that goes off on its own thing for a little while, and then everyone else is.
It's a little on the nose too, though. Isn't Star Trek kind of tries to be a little bit more allegorical?
Yeah, okay, but one of the best Deep Space Nine episodes is Far Beyond
the Stars. Yeah, as I was saying that, I realized you don't get more on the nose than Far Beyond.
Yeah, I'm okay with on the nose from time to time.
Yeah,
and what I will say, Rios is the best of the new characters.
Mm-hmm.
He's the first time that they pulled off your Han Solo type in the Star Trek world.
And before we go, I just wanted to shout out, you mentioned the Borg Queen. That was played by Anne Worship, who just passed away from cancer.
Right, and she's great. I will say all of the actors are doing the best they can with the plot that they have. It's just that the plot that they have doesn't make any sense.
That leads us all to, as we said, in a few days, we're going to see Star Trek Picard Season 3, which is, all intents and purposes, Season 8 of Next Generation, because literally everyone from Worf to the Forge to Crusher to Troy to Riker, all on the show. Spiner's back. He's not playing Data because I think Data's gone for good.
Right, because he really wanted to die at the end of Season 1.
But
that was his wish.
But it looks like Spiner is back as somebody.
Yeah.
Probably a Sung or something.
Well, I mean, they did say, they do make it clear in the trailers. He's Lore.
Oh, he's Lore. Lore's back.
Yeah.
Guess what? Goalie Nutrition is sponsoring Hard NOC Life, and you can go to goalie.com to buy apple cider vinegar gummies. They're ashwagandha gummies, superfruit gummies, and super greens gummies. And you get 10% off plus free shipping if you use the code HARDKNOC at goalie.com. This is honestly, I've been taking the goalie gummies now for a couple weeks, and I have to say, they're tasty and they're good for you. Have you guys been enjoying the goalie gummies?
I really like them. They're yummy, but it's a nice to add to my routine of already I normally take just straight vitamin C, so it's nice to have extra supplements.
For a long time, people have praised the benefits of apple cider vinegar, and as someone who's had to drink straight apple cider vinegar sometimes when I'm not feeling well, or I have some joint pain, and your mom was like, drink some apple cider vinegar. It's not the most appetizing home remedy, let's just say.
No, right. It tastes horrible.
The apple cider part is ooh, does it taste like apple cider? And it's no, it tastes like vinegar. But ACV is very good for you. And the fact that Goalie has been able to put the ACV into these tasty little gummies made with pectin and fruit peels, which make them vegan, which is cool. So if you're vegan, you can still rock these gummies, because everyone knows gummies are usually made out of gelatin and nasty shit. These are made out of complete non-GMO, gelatin-free, gluten-free, vegan ingredients, and you can get the benefits, all of the benefits of apple cider vinegar, taking these tasty, delicious, convenient gummies. So go to goalie.com and use the code Hard NOC. That's HARDNOC, just like the podcast you're listening to. Get 10% off your purchase of Goalie products and free shipping.
It's a much better delivery device for that apple cider vinegar.
Yeah.
These Goalie gummies are great. You get it, and it's a delicious little candy. And I've been enjoying the Superfruits one. I did feel kind of refreshed after taking a few of those.
Yeah, no, but I'm loving them so far, and they're definitely tasty. If you just want tasty gummies, at least just eat them for the yumminess.
Yeah. So go to goalie.com, use the code HARDNOC, HARDNOC, get 10% off your purchase and free shipping at goalie.com with the code HARDNOC. So before we wrap up, I did one of the reasons we came together in anticipation for season 3 of Picard is we wanted to look back on our favorite episodes of Next Generation. So we're going to do this in top 5 mode, counting down from 5 to 1. What our favorite episodes are. So like I said, we don't know which episodes we're going to name, although we've kind of like alluded to a few of them already. So what we'll do is we'll start at number 5. We'll reveal to each other what that episode is, and then we'll talk about why we chose it. And if it ends up being like we've already talked about an episode, we won't have to like dig into it again. You know what I'm saying? So do you have your list in front of you?
Yeah, I do.
Let's start at number 5. I already said my number 5, Encounter at Farpoint. Your number 5 is...
It's the episode Clues. Do you remember Clues?
No. and full disclosure, I had to go back and do some homework just to remind myself because there's so many goddamn episodes of Next Generation.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine a show in the 21st century that has 7 seasons and has 26 episodes in each season? Like, no one's ever going to do that ever again.
Yeah.
So Clues is an episode, it's season 4, I believe. And essentially everybody's missing 2 weeks out of their life and they don't know why. And it's one of those premises that it's an interesting mystery that if you really think too hard about it, it doesn't make any sense. But while you're watching the episode, it's a great time. And it's, for me, I think it's a great showcase of what I was saying about Dr. Crusher, because she's the first one to notice that something's off, and she typically would get like at least an episode a season where she plays the kind of science detective, and this is to me my favorite example of that kind of show, where she goes around trying to solve like why are things off, but no one says anything or no one notices, and you find out they go to a planet they go to a spirit of space that just wants to kill everyone that enters their space. And so they make a deal with them. Just if we make us forget that we ever came here, we promise we'll never come back. Just erase our memories. But even after they erase their memories, they start to put together like, wait, why are our memories erased? So they go back. And it's just a fun sci-fi mystery that is a great example of like the kind of episodes that Star Trek Next Generation could do.
I don't remember that episode. What, even in your description of it, I don't remember it.
She's got these little like Christmas ornaments that have like little pink flowers or little pink fungi growing inside them, and they're like different sizes, and like that's how she knows that time's gone on, because they didn't fix that problem. It's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, I already gave the reasons why I chose Encounter at Farpoint. It was the first one. It was the one that hooked me in. I became a fan of Next Generation because of that. And at the end of it, isn't that where we see Bones?
Yes, he's at the end of the first part of it. But yeah, he's in it.
I just remember I have a distinct memory of like seeing is he walking with LaForge or someone, or with
Data?
That just is a memory of mine that I just remember sitting in the office watching Encounter at Farpoint, seeing Q and quick aside, our mother favorite soap opera was Days of Our Lives. She learned English watching that when she first came to this country, and John Delancey was on Days of Our Lives, and I think that was another reason I was like kind of like hooked in, because I just recognized him. He was romantically linked to Arlene Sorkin, who became Harley Quinn, so like the geek bona fides of Days of Our Lives. Number 4, coincidentally, there are 4 lights. Chain of Command.
Oh, okay. Sure.
For you?
For me, it's the season 3 episode, Who Watches the Watchers?
So I'll go first. I chose Chain of Command because that is the most deep. That's the Deep Space 90th Next Generation episode. not just because it features the Cardassians, but that wasn't the debut of the Cardassians, was it?
No, the Cardassians show up at least a season earlier.
Okay, but that was like their most prominent episode, I feel like, at least in my memory. But it's the one where they torture Picard,
right?
Because Picard's like leading some like secret mission, and he gets captured, and they're basically gaslighting him. They're like, they make him look at these lights, and they'll let him go if he's like, just say there are 5 of them, just to show like, you know, that they can control reality. Like they can, like, it's literally about gaslighting, right? And he's like defiantly claims there are 4 lights and like loses his mind essentially.
Right. Well, he's just on the verge of it, and what's great about that episode is one of those actors that like you can put up with Patrick Stewart and they're gonna duel in their dialogue in a really great way.
So why did you choose Who Watches the Watchers?
So Who Watches the Watchers is an episode where the Federation have scientists in a duck blind and they study pre-warp civilizations. And the duck blind is damaged somehow, and so they get exposed, and basically the aliens who are distant relatives of Vulcans, though they don't know it yet, start worshiping the Federation and Picard specifically, because here are these people with super technology and that they think is magic, and they start relating it to their old kind of religious beliefs. And so it's kind of the prime example of the Prime Directive, which is kind of one of those classic Star Trek problems, you know, asking like, if we are in the future and we do have these technological marvels, well, what are the rules behind it? Not just on a scientific level, but on a moral and ethical level. And so the Prime Directive is this kind of central element of all of Star Trek. There's always you're not a Star Trek show unless you have an episode talking about, do we violate the Prime Directive? And it's always interesting to see when they come to the decision of, yes, it's okay to violate, or no, it's not okay to violate. And here it's this accident. They accidentally violated the Prime Directive. And so what do you do to fix that? And to me, it's interesting because once you start contrasting it with all those other Prime Directive episodes, you start to figure out that Starfleet has like terrible foreign policy because they're not kind of consistent about it. And the captains break Prime Directive whenever it kind of suits them. So this is one of those episodes where the Prime Directive is viewed in a really positive light, and I like it for that. But it shows kind of exactly what, like, how to think about cultural dialogue, which I think is a central theme of all of the Next Generation, all of Star Trek, and I'll get into it a little bit later in my other pick.
So number 3, I have Tapestry.
That was close. I had that in that's like 6 for me.
Oh, okay.
It was on the list. Tapestry
is probably one of the best Q episodes. Sure. It's basically like if Picard, it's like what's the Jimmy Stewart? It's a Wonderful Life.
Right.
This is what your life would be like if you had chosen a different path. And he said the alien he fights with are called Nausicaans, right?
Yep.
And at the time, I didn't realize, were they named after the Miyazaki movie?
I don't know. I think it's probably possible, or maybe there is some sort of root science fiction.
The Nausica is some sort of a science fiction. But yeah, I mean, at the time, because like they're these, like, they don't look nothing like anything from a Miyazaki movie, but like kind of like reading back up, you know, like I said, doing the research, I was like, oh wait, that's how you spell Nausicaan?
Yeah, that's true.
But essentially, like Q basically like gives Picard like a second lease on life, and but now he's no longer a captain of the Enterprise. He's like a nobody on the Enterprise.
Right, because he was too brash. He regrets being too brash as a young man. And so when given the opportunity from Q to have a do-over, he's a more mature, more controlled person in his cadet years. And then when they go into the future, you see that controlled person is not the person he thought it would be.
Right.
It didn't make his life better in the way that he thought it would.
And because he actually does die in the beginning of the episode, right? Like, doesn't he get shot
because his artificial heart,
which was a result of his like fight,
of his brash actions as a young man. Yeah,
I recall like there's a scene where Picard's in the movie uniform, like the Kirk movie.
Yeah, his cadet years, because his cadet years are overlapping, I guess, with Kirk. The time of the
movies, of the original movie. Yeah,
right.
So that was cool too. To see Picard in the Star Trek movie uniform. So your number 3, you said, was what?
So my number 3 is The Wounded.
That's the other Cardassian episode.
Yeah, it's.
You wrote about that for the Nerds of Color, actually.
Oh yeah, right, exactly.
You long time ago, 10 years ago, at the beginning of the website, when you were when you used to write for us. Yeah, you wrote about Miles O'Brien.
It's Miles O'Brien's only episode that he gets like real character, really getting into
only Next Generation episode where he gets character.
Yeah, only Next Generation
character
episode.
in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, and it sets up the Cardassians, like the behavior of the Cardassians here really defines those antagonists for the Federation for the rest of it. So like in a lot of ways, a lot of the elements and like the political intrigue even of stuff that goes on in The Wounded really lines up with where Deep Space Nine will go. And which is like a great example of like the Next Generation can do an episode like this, but because it's a run and gun, we're going off to the next planet, you don't really touch on it again, whereas Deep Space Nine is going to deal with the Cardassians for 7 years. So it's kind of a backdoor. I love Deep Space Nine so much that retroactively The Wounded is one of my favorite episodes of the Next Generation.
Number 2?
So my number 2 is actually All Good Things.
So I debated, and I was going to make All Good Things my number 2, but I decided to make that my number 1. My number 2 is The Inner Light.
Sure. Okay.
So let me talk about The Inner Light first.
Okay.
Since All Good Things is my number 1, and just say that like that was the one I remember affecting me when I was a kid watching it. And not being prepared for an episode like that. It's one of those things that like it pulls the rug from under you, because like so many Star Trek episodes take place on alien worlds and they're encountering different species and everything like that. But Picard was a whole different dude, living a whole life, experiencing an entire lifetime, playing the flute, and on a doomed planet essentially. Right. And just like that blew my mind as a teenager, right? Like this idea that you could, it was like Interstellar before Interstellar. Like you could live an entire lifetime in like 20 minutes or whatever.
Is that what that movie's about? I haven't seen it.
Oh, and you've never seen Interstellar? Well, no, Interstellar. There's a lot of time dilation in Interstellar as well.
I see. Okay. So that's what that's about. Yeah, no.
It's like he's got that whole vibe of like, the planet is being doomed and he's Jor-El essentially, like, we have to save our planet. And it's actually, 30 years later, quite prophetic of people trying to like tell us about the end of our planet. And if we don't.
Well, right. I mean, even at the time that show was coming out, I mean, the ozone, it was probably most directly, the metaphor was the ozone layer. Right. And again, a way to like, it's not a political message, but it's taking a message and putting it in a interesting narrative device to kind of, when we're asking people for empathy, right? Like it's to essentially have a device that forces you into someone else's shoes for their whole lifetime. It's a stunning idea of like kind of how to have radical empathy.
Yeah. So that's my number 2. I'll let you reveal your number 1 because I said All Good Things was number 1 for me. So what's number 1 for you?
So my number 1 is actually season 5 episode Darmok.
Darmok, yeah, I knew that was coming.
And Jalad at Tanagra. Yeah, absolutely. I the more I think about it, as a second generation from an immigrant family, I think that's one of the reasons that this episode speaks to me a lot. For people who don't know the episode, an alien species that the Federation has never been able to communicate with reach out and try to communicate with the Federation. They send the Enterprise. They try to talk to each other. They can't understand each other. Suddenly, the captain transports Picard and himself to this third-party empty planet, and they try to talk to each other, but they're not figuring it out. They don't understand each other, but there's a monster that's going to destroy them. And the tension's rising between these two ships as the failure to communicate continues to grow. And so the big reveal or the trick is, it turns out that species completely communicates through the use of metaphor, to say it the way that Picard says it. They use narratives and past narratives, alluding to past narratives within their embedded history to share stories with one another, to communicate. And for me, like, every time I watch that episode, I'm still like blown away by the way that it captures understanding a culture through its language, and like the wealth of knowledge that you can get from just like tackling the language of a culture, and how you get so much history and how you get so much layers and meanings out of it when you start to learn another culture's stories. And like, for me, I think that mirrors a lot of kind of my journey in trying to learn and understand more Chinese. That like, I think part of my problem is that I'm not interested so much in fluency so much as I am in trying to understand the inside jokes and allusions that exist in the Chinese language that a person who's raised in Chinese kind of knows intuitively. I have to learn myself. And I feel like that process gets reflected in what happens in Darmok.
Shout out Paul Winfield.
Excellent. And doing it in that makeup.
So your number 2, my number 1, All Good Things. And it was the series finale of Next Generation. And as we learned at the beginning of the pod, the catalyst for your Trek fandom. Why was it number 2 for you, though?
Well, like, I asked at the beginning if this was a top 5 and a countdown, because like, really, it's pretty close to me for The Wounded, but it's probably the best ending of any of the series.
Yeah.
Like, I like it more than What You Leave Behind. I like it more than Endgame. Those are all pretty good endings, but All Good Things to me has the best mission statement of Star Trek.
The only thing that would make it better is if it turned out it was a Riker holodeck program.
Yeah, right. You didn't respond to my text about this yesterday, but I do want to pitch that I think the way to think about the Next Generation is that we as the fans are the Q continuum. Yeah. And that Q is the whole, every time Q shows up, he's basically a writer who has to like give a new problem to the crew because the continuum's getting mad. So he's just showing up and trying to like write a new scenario for them.
I do realize in my top 5, there are 3 Q episodes.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because it's interesting because he shows up first as this kind of trickster character, and he's really like marked as the trickster character, but more of the episodes are about him trying to provide moral guidance than they are about him like being a dick. Like, he's always a dick, but he's got like a relatively good intention pretty much after the season 3, after Deja Q, where he was a human. Like, he learned a little bit of empathy as a human, and he was not a terrible person or not a terrible omnipotent being for the rest of the series. But he says the mission statement.
As a Trekkie, it is so unfortunate that Q has become synonymous with like right-wing paranoia and conspiracy theory, because it's like
true, yeah.
When you talk about Q, it's like it's almost like you can't wear red hats anymore, and you can't talk about Q without sounding like a crazy person.
But yeah, All Good Things, he says at the end of it as kind of an epilogue for the show, and the mission statement that he says that for that one fraction of a second, you were open to options you had never considered. That is the exploration that awaits for you. Not mapping stars and studying nebula, but charting the unknown possibilities of existence. And I think that last bit, that charting the unknown possibilities of existence, is what makes good Star Trek. Like, when Star Trek is great, it's because it's opening your mind to some idea in a fun way and in an accessible way. And I think that All Good Things like captures that exactly.
And I'm pretty sure you may not remember, you were 10 years old, but when Picard joins the poker's table and deals out the cards, and I think his last line is something along with like the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
I bawled completely.
Did you?
I was crying. I don't know if you clearly you don't remember. So here's the thing. Such a great ending, right? Like just to see the crew sitting around the poker table and with the sky being the limit, right? Like what a way to send your cast off into the sunset. Is there a fear now though to see them come? I mean, granted, there's been 5 movies in between, right? Or 4 movies. How many?
4 Next Generation movies.
4 movies in between where, like, as we've already alluded to, not a lot of great things happen to this crew. So I guess maybe that does lessen the like blow a little bit, right? Like such a perfect ending to only lead into, you know, the destruction of the Enterprise in the movie, and then, you know, a lackluster B plot in First Contact. You know, as much as I like the, you know, the night must be drawn here, like the stuff on Earth with Zephyr Cochrane was not great, at least in retrospect. And what's the next movie after Insurrection? Jesus, there's Star Trek has Insurrection and Q. They were such presages to our modern political environment. Yeah, Insurrection was the F. Murray Abraham with his skin stretched, right? Like that's that movie. That's all I remember about that movie.
Yeah, that's the one.
And then like Insurrection's not even the good TNG episode, I think is the common refrain.
Well, it's like a forgettable. It's like a okay Next Generation episode that ran on too long. Like they made it a 2-parter when it didn't need to be.
And whatever the hell Nemesis was, right?
Yeah.
Other than like Tom Hardy chewing scenery, which is always great.
Yeah, and it was interesting because that one was like I think the first one that was the last one, and it wasn't written by like Star Trek writers. And I feel like that goes into a lot of like why it feels so tonally different than the last ones. So
in that sense, perhaps Picard 3 gives the opportunity to really give the Next Generation cast the closure that All Good Things promised, right? Because like had they not graduated to the movies, All Good Things would be unsullied. So yeah, but I think that All Good Things ends in a way that, you know, those characters will keep going, right? And I mean, we get to see their future selves in that episode. What's so great about that episode, right? Like, at least a variant of their future selves. Right. No, and that's definitely an interesting part, right? Because like All Good Things, they jump 25 years into the future, and here we are. We're there now. Yeah, we're past it, aren't we? Or we're not quite. No, we're past the point that they visit. It's interesting that like. It's interesting to see like the makeup choices for like, what will old Picard look like, and what actually old Picard looks like. It's just funny. Yeah. So we'll end there. What's the one thing you're most looking forward to in Picard 3 before we wrap up? Oh man. I think I'm looking forward to honestly I'm looking forward to Worf. Everything that I've read so far, everything that I've heard so far, Worf is still Worf in a great way, and I'm excited to see that character. He's probably the heart and soul of that era of Star Trek, and so I'm really interested to see where they go with that. Yeah, I would say Worf and Geordi are like the 2 characters that I'm most excited to see come back, because I also think they get the shortest shrift in the movies. And Geordi gets a short shrift on the series. I mean, let's be real. Yeah, no, I think that's true. Right, and that's like, it's interesting that, you know, we kind of see this crew as like this big family and stuff, and certainly they are. But you know, a lot of it happens gradually over that 7 years, and you see who doesn't. When you look back on it, you're like, oh yeah, he didn't do as much as I thought he did. I mean, even Worf, as much as I loved Worf, I feel like he was a much better character on Deep Space Nine than he ever was on Next Generation. Well, I think he had a lot of growth on Next Generation. He evolved as a character, but like he really came into his own, I felt, in Deep Space Nine. Sure. That's for when they bring back Sisko and do a Paramount Plus series about Sisko coming back from the Prophets. Yeah.
if Avery Brooks shows up at some point during Picard season 3, I will message like, hey, let's do a best top 5 of Deep Space Nine.
Oh
shit, Deep Space. Here's the thing with Deep Space. Talking about presaging, they presaged the era of serialized storytelling. You know what I mean?
Right, absolutely.
That's all Star Trek is now, is all serialized. And that's honestly why it's so hard for me to get into it.
Well, right. Well, it's the problem.
I mean, Strange New Worlds, I think, is back to like the original kind of episodic storytelling, right? But
yeah, Strange New Worlds is more episodic, and so is Lower Decks. But the thing is that like their version of serialization has gone definitely much more down the Lost J.J. Abrams style.
Right. Mystery box. Yeah, in
all of the like bad ways. I expect the smoke monster to show up at some point.
For sure. Here's an interesting fact. We named not quite 10 episodes because we had a couple overlaps, but didn't make our top 5s. Best of Both Worlds.
Yeah.
Yesterday's Enterprise.
Yeah, Yesterday's Enterprise was in my top 10, but it's not in my top 5.
Cause and Effect.
Top 10, not top 5.
Borg.
Yeah, that's the last one for me.
Measure of a Man. I lied. I said Measure of a Man was in my top 5. I realized it wasn't. But yeah, like, these are classic TNG episodes that we didn't even. That just thought that was interesting.
Well, it's because I think there's a difference between like the best episodes that are kind of like objectively. If we were to do a poll, I'm sure Best of Both Worlds, is up.
I mean, that's the chalk answer, right? Like that's what everyone says is the best Star Trek.
Right.
And that's why everything. I mean, everything references it. You know, and like it's almost like. I think Picard is over his Borg PTSD by now. You know what I'm saying? Like we don't.
Well, he was over it by the end of season 5 because he didn't commit genocide. He had the opportunity to kill all the Borg, and he said no. And
yet
we were kind of done with it.
Every Picard story, there's always like some dream sequence where he's on the Borg.
They always forget that he figured this out already.
Well, the line must be drawn here, and clearly it's been drawn several times.
Yeah.
They can't stop drawing that line. Anyway, that's Hard NOC Life. That's Picard. It's nice getting back to our Trek roots because I think when this site launched 10 years ago, we talked about Star Trek a whole goddamn lot. We even had like a Star Trek week at one point where we were doing nothing but Star Trek talk. You would think this was a Star Trek website, and 10 years later, we barely talk about the show. So thank you for bringing it back, Raymond.
Thank you, Patrick Stewart, and let's see how this goes. Depending on how this goes, I may have more things to say about it.
We'll see. Come back at the end of the season and see. We'll see. We'll revisit.
Yeah.
Until then, I know you can't find Raymond on social media, but you can find me at The Real Chow, _real_Chow on Twitter, and at Real Keith Chow on Instagram. Follow The Nerds of Color at The Nerds of Color on all platforms. And go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all the other podcasts in the Hard NOC family. Give us a rating and review if you do. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/The Nerds of Color. Buy merch at tpublic.com. Search The Nerds of Color and subscribe to videos on youtube.com/The Nerds of Color. And until next time, Raymond Chow, you have the last word.
Live long and prosper.
Make it so.